Hi, my name is Todd Damotte, and I'm an artist. And I love to create art, and I love to share my art with others. And whether it's painting on a canvas in front of a live audience, or it's editing a video to upload online, or to illustrate a children's book, I love to create art, and I love to share art. And one of my newest creations is that of a young boy. His name is Andey Jones. Andey lives in his imagination. He goes on to wild and crazy adventures into his mind. At the drop of a hat, he can go to an unexplored planet, or a dark and musty cave, or a jungle teeming with angry animals. He can go anywhere at any time using his imagination. And it's during this journey that I've learned so much about myself, about my artwork, and I'd love to share with you the journey that I've taken. So the process of starting this book really began down here in my studio. This is where Andey came out of my head and onto paper. I had some leftover poster board that had some permanent marker writing on it, and so I covered it up with some acrylic paint, utilizing two complementary colors to get this mix of color and texture. Once it was dry, I just started to, as I call, creatively vomit. I just needed to get something out that was within me. And sometimes it's just spitting it up onto a canvas, onto paper, just to see what comes out. The first illustration I created was of Andey in his newspaper hat, his lion-hearted shield on his arm, and sword in hand. And there's a fox and a wolf surrounding him in circles, going after each other, oblivious to Andey, but we're in the way of Andey being able to get hold of this lost coin. I created that illustration, and Andey, who before this time had been more of a figment of my imagination, just a character that didn't really have any type of a form. This was the first time that he had come to life. I just fell in love with him. I fell in love with the way he looked. I fell in love in the way that he interacted with the characters, with the way that he uses his imagination and how I can relate to that so well. I love the illustration. And so one became two, that became three, and then soon I had dozens of these illustrations of Andey going on adventures and quests. Even his friends, Bianca and Calvin, surfaced as well. Here I was with all these illustrations, and I didn't really know what to do with them. And so somebody suggested to me, Todd, create a children's book. And I thought, that's a great idea. And so even though I had the stories already in my head, I began the process of writing them. And even though I'm an artist, first and foremost, I was able to craft these stories, to write what was going on in my head and get down onto paper. What a beautiful process it was just to see all of this come to life and to see Andey begin his adventures out into the real world, outside of my own mind, but onto the paper, using ink and paint as his steps into this life. As Andey came out onto the paper, I began to think of, where did all this come from? When I was growing up, my imagination, just like Andey, was my superpower. It was my best friend. I spent so much time imagining, creating. I could escape for hours on end, imagining all the things that Andey does. There's a lot of me when you read Andey, when you see him. There's a lot of Todd in there. But not only can you see Todd, but my son Xavier. He is 10 years old right now, much like Andey, and he became a very literal inspiration that I used a lot of his traits. He's very imaginative, very creative. He also has a very tender heart. Those are many of the traits I tried to embed within who Andey is. Another part of the inspiration is that of Andey's best friend, Calvin. If you're a student in the comics of the late 80s and the early 90s, you may have recognized Calvin from the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. I loved Calvin and Hobbes. I loved how they interacted. I loved how Hobbes was only real in Calvin's mind. and how real he truly was. Everyone else saw a stuffed tiger, but to him it was real. How they went on their own adventures, how they used their imagination, that inspired me to a whole new level. And you can see elements of Calvin and Hobbes in Andey. Another inspiration were the writings of Shel Silverstein. I have many of his books. I love reading through those poems, even today as an adult. And even my son and my other children, they love Calvin and Hobbes and they love Shel Silverstein, and I will catch them reading and rereading and rereading the comics and the poems because they are so inspirational, so creative, and really tap that aspect of imagination and creativity. And you can see elements of all of those in the books. Where did the name Andey Jones come from? When Xavier was about 3 or 4 years old, we had gone to the toy store to look at some potential birthday presents. At the time, Indiana Jones was really big. And when we came home, I asked him about it. What's your name?
My name is Xavier.
I said, hey, what did you see at the store? He had a hard time saying Indiana, and it came out
Andey and the Jones.
Andey and the Jones. That was something that has stuck with me. Speaking of inspirations, one of the things that was driving me during the process of creating this book was the fact that within our culture right now, our kids are stuck in front of tablets, in front of phones, in front of TVs, in front of gaming consoles. They consume their entertainment, they consume their information on a daily basis. And I can remember as a kid, I was always in my imagination, going, exploring, battling evil guys, searching for things that had never been found before. And that was really one of the greatest joys of my childhood. And through this process of writing the stories, I've been very intentional to try to bring the reader along, to invite them along for the journeys and for the adventures. And so each story is written to try to involve them, to ask open-ended questions, to get them to use their imagination so that they can enjoy, so that they can ultimately create. When I started this journey, it wasn't really something that I had set out to write this book or even to create all these illustrations. Ultimately, like I said, I just needed to get something out. And one thing turned into another, and this whole character and the storyline has evolved to a point that I never would have dreamed of. My desire is to share these stories with you, to share Andey's adventures, but not only that, to inspire you, to inspire children and adults to embrace creativity, to enter into their imaginations, because life is so much more enjoyable when you can just freely create. As I continue to flesh out the rest of the stories and the adventures of Andey Jones, I just want to encourage you to stay up to date with all the things that are going on with Andey. The best way is to head to his website, andeyjones.com, where you can find out more about Andey, you can find out more about the characters, the adventure team of Bianca, Calvin, and Andey. You can see some of the bad guys. You can learn more just about how to embrace your imagination. Andey is also very connected when it comes to social media. He has his own Facebook page, he has his own Instagram account and Twitter account. So there are many ways for you to be able to stay connected with Andey and what's going on in his world. Andey has created his own world of imagination called the Imaginarium. And this is where he goes on adventures, exploring through his imagination. And most of the time he's taking his friends. And so let me invite you to join Andey on his adventures. Grab your newspaper hat, your sword and your shield, and let's go exploring. Let's go find the hidden treasure. Let's rescue our friends from being kidnapped. And let's battle against Pegleg and his pirate foes. Adventure awaits.
You're only one step away from your next adventure.
Shay Signair.